Welcome back, my friends. Jake here. Today, I am joined with an incredible guest, and I can only describe this man as a Renaissance man for all the things that he does. He is a 20-year retired veteran of the United States Army. He's an author, a cybersecurity expert, a computer programmer, an open source intelligence analyst, a triathlete, and even a cartoonist. I heard him mention in one of his previous interviews. So, if you're not familiar with Ryan McBeth, his YouTube channel is approaching 500,000 subscribers, and he's also approaching 200 million channel views. Very impressive. And even if you're not subscribed to him, I guarantee you've seen one of his YouTube shorts quickly explaining something related to the Russia Ukraine conflict, often in his bathrobe. Welcome, Ryan. For those who don't know you, do you want to add anything to that introduction?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. I don't really think of myself as a cybersecurity expert, but I appreciate the vote of confidence. I know more than some, less than others.
You got to know more than 99% of the population.
I appreciate the vote of confidence.
So, did I get that right? Are you a 20-year retired Army veteran?
20-year retired. I did time in the National Guard. I also I spent a lot of time deployed on active duty, just constant deployments after the terrorist attacks. That was the big thing.
So, when did you leave the service?
2014.
Oh, okay. So you've been out for a couple of years now.
Yeah, I mean, I have the fat to show it. Absolutely.
So you were an E7. In the Air Force, we call those master sergeants, but in the Army, is that sergeant first class?
Sergeant first class. You could also say platoon sergeant. Both are correct.
And what was your specialty? What did you primarily do while serving?
I was 11 Bravo infantry. Although when we started, there was another MOS, another job code. I think you called them AFICs or AFACs. MOS, military occupational specialty. I was an 11 Bravo, but I started as 11 Hotel, which is anti-tank, and then that job was poof, it went away when the Army decided to consolidate. So we all became 11 Bravos.
Once again, an impressive background. Everyone who makes it 20 years active duty or 20 years total has my respect and admiration. I only made it 6. I recently separated. And I think your channel has exploded in popularity comparable to mine due to this ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I want to ask you, I'm sure there's lots of reasons, but in your mind, what is the primary reason why Russia launched this full-scale invasion of Ukraine earlier in February?
So I'm not really a political guy, but a lot of people have said it was over oil, in the Sea of Azov. But Russia has plenty of oil, and there's really no reason to spend money to get a resource you already have plenty of, especially when some would say climate change is creating more opportunity to drill in the Arctic. So I honestly think it's because Russia is really a mafia-run gas station. That's what it is, right? And there's people who are in Russia who have relatives in Ukraine, and they call each other, they visit each other. And I think what scares Russia is the idea of a budding democracy to their south. Ukraine is not perfect. Ukraine is a corrupt country, and there are oligarchs in Ukraine. And that's a problem. But they're more free than Russia. They're not an authoritarian state like Russia is. And I think the scary part to President Putin is the idea that his people might look at Ukraine and seeing a Western-leaning democracy where the standard of living is higher than the standard of living in Russia, and they might say, wait a minute, maybe we're backing the wrong horse here. So I think that's kind of where this invasion came from. Is let's try to replace the government in Ukraine. Let's try to get something that's more Russia-leaning than Western-leaning, and then we don't have to worry about our southern flank.
The joke I've heard is that the government in Moscow is not a government that operates an oil industry. It's a gas company that operates a government.
I would buy that. I would buy that. And Russia has a lot of important assets: fertilizer, rocket technology, and space exploration. At least for a long time, where Russia was critical to space exploration. Fertilizer, chemicals, wheat. Yeah, there's a lot of things that Russia exports.
A lot of raw materials as well, yes.
Yeah.
So there's lots of topics you could be talking about on YouTube. Can I ask, do you have any personal motivation? Like, what is your driving factor for supporting Ukraine and talking about this conflict?
I believe in freedom. I think that everybody should have a chance to determine their own destiny and not have to live under a boot. So that's one thing. Um, I'm motivated by, I did this anti-tank stuff for 20 years. I know a little bit, and it's almost like this 20 years of studying finally paid off. Like like I finally have, there's finally a reason I read all those manuals. I memorized all this stuff. I memorized identifying tanks. It's like it finally paid off. And I have something to add to the conversation. Only 0.5% of anybody has ever served, at least in the US. So there is certainly a lack of good information, as to how a tow missile works or why a Russian T-72 blows up the way it blows up, when it's a catastrophic kill. But I think I finally have an opportunity to educate people on this stuff, on something that I used to love to talk about. I also think that I'm a big believer in learning something new every day. I own over 2,000 books. I just finished a book this weekend and started another one, like literally right on the beach. The book that I just finished was about Crazy Eddie Antar, who was I'm a little bit older than you, so Crazy Eddie Antar was a businessman in New York City who had an electronics store chain, and he committed major fraud at his company. And I finished that book, and I started reading about how we recovered a Russian submarine from the seafloor using the Glomar Explorer. So I'm in the middle of that book now. So I'm
Wow.
always learning something, and I would love for people to learn something new every day.
I definitely have learned a lot from your YouTube shorts and your channel.
Yeah, thank you.
It's great that you share this information. I also want to echo what you said in that there are lots of service members from militaries around the world, not just the United States, who spent years or decades studying these, weapon equipment systems, these strategies and tactics to feel like it was never going to be used. I can talk about my personal experience with ICBMs. I mean, we only maintain these 450 launchers in the Great Plains because of one adversary. And while I was serving the whole time, I just was thinking to myself, Russia's never going to do anything. I mean, we've had these sorties on alert since the 1960s and 70s. The Cold War ended in the early 90s. Why are we still doing this? Why am I doing this right now? Sure enough, I get out of the service in February. 2 weeks later, Russia invades Ukraine, and yeah, everything that I studied and everything I did feels more serious, feels more relevant now to what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I could have told you that you guys helped save the world, right? You guys helped prevent World War III from happening just by being ready. I think the missileers are fascinating.
Yeah, there used to be 11 missile wings at the height of the war
Yeah.
under Nixon, and then it just got scaled down, and now there's just the three in Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, obviously, at the beginning of this invasion in February, Russia had every advantage as far as experience, equipment, personnel. Why do you think, after 7 months, that the Russian military has so underperformed?
I think a lot of it has to do with training. Um, for the most part, if you take away the javelins, for the most part, Russia and Ukraine have similar equipment, at least at the starting point they did. They both had Soviet-era fighters, with Russia having a slight advantage to more modern fighters. They both had the same kinds of tanks. You could argue that the T-64 was maybe a little bit better than some of the, the remodeled T-64 was a little bit better than what Russia was putting out. But for the most part, their tanks were at parity. Their armored fighting vehicles were at parity. I think a lot of it just came down to training. I mean, if Russia had a year to train their troops and actually took their training seriously, I think we would have seen a different outcome. So I think training is the major factor. The other problem for Russia is logistics. They just don't have a modern logistics system. And a lot of that's because their logistics were set up, and I did a video on this. There's logistics were set up for what's called push logistics, where essentially they're designed to fight a nuclear war, where you get supplies whether you need it or not. And they have mathematical formulas and tables, and they go, all right, a motor rifle unit can fight for 72 hours. Then they need this much water, this much fuel, this much ammunition, and so on. And they push it to you. And your count might be off, but it's wasteful, but so is war. NATO has pull logistics, where you call back and you say, hey, I need this thing, or I need a log pack with this, 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 and this, and you get sent that log pack. I think the reason Russia did that, it's just easier to simplify logistics by using push logistics. And it would also be useful in a nuclear war, because if communications were down to from electromagnetic pulse, you're getting your stuff whether you asked for it or not. And so that's actually a really smart way of doing things, and it works well if you have a lot of stuff. But I think because their logistics were set up to fight this one narrow war, they didn't have enough trucks, they didn't have enough logistical specialists, and they don't know how to palletize anything. I did a video about that this morning. That American howitzer charges, which is the propellant that you put into the howitzer to make the gun fire. Americans, we have this palletized, and they're in these containers that you can pull off, and the containers have
Can you explain
handholds.
in more detail what you mean by palletize?
Sure. So pallet by when you go to Costco, and there's a on the floor, there's usually a pallet. It's holding up the goods that you're selling, and you can move that pallet around by forklift. Well, Russia doesn't tend to palletize their stuff. They're loading it into box cars, or they're throwing it onto trucks, and they just don't have the tactical forklifts to move this stuff around. And so it's a very human-centric mode of transportation. Whereas NATO is all about palletization. We have specialized shipping containers. We have specialized HEMTs that I can't remember the name of them, but you can put the container on the HEMT. The HEMT puts it right up on top of the vehicle. You can move out with the stuff, and everything down to, like I said, the charges. They can be palletized. You can take them off of the pallet with a gloved hand, and there's plenty of handholds on it. They can be stacked. So everything that NATO has is centered around palletization and easy movement through logistics. And Russia's still fighting as if it were World War II.
Stuff just tossed in the back of a truck with a blanket over it or something.
Yeah, you see that. And also what you've seen is Russia's run out of trucks to the point where they're using civilian trucks. And I've seen pictures of this, they've taken artillery rounds, and they've literally thrown the artillery rounds in the back of trucks. They've taken them out of the packing crates, because the crates add weight.
Oh, wow.
So they're just throwing these rounds in. Now, they're not fused, but it's still not something I want to do either, right?
Yeah.
So it's just I don't want to say they don't know how to fight a war, but they certainly don't know how to do modern logistics.
I've heard the Russian military's level of discipline be described as a biker gang. It's basically anything that goes, goes. Can I ask, are you surprised by the recent success the Ukrainian military has had in the Kharkiv counteroffensive?
I'm not surprised in the sense that I knew it was I knew something was coming. I'm not surprised at their success. I am surprised at the speed of their success. I it's easier to defend than it is to attack. When you're in a defense, your ammunition is right there. You have shorter supply lines. You know where the enemy's coming from. You can get into you have nice bunkers that you can fight from where the enemy has to attack you, right in front of your bunker. So I thought the Russians would stand and fight, and they didn't. For the most part, they didn't. And I can't figure that out because they had every single advantage available to them, and they just didn't. So that kind of surprised me. I thought there would be more resistance on the Russian side. I don't believe that Ukraine has crossed the Oskil River yet. And taking anything back in that area, that area of the country is, well, it's really more like south. It's a lot like Kansas. It's very flat, very fertile. A lot of farms, a lot of rivers, and every time you come to a river, you got to cross it. So
according to the latest military maps, they have crossed the Oskil River and the Severodonetsk River. The Russian forces just keep getting routed. As you said, they had every advantage playing defense. Near the city of Lyman, near Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, this river has been the front line for 4 or 5 months. And somehow, the Ukrainians are getting across it to push towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk.
Yeah, I haven't. I just got home from work. I haven't looked at a map yet today. I need to do that. But that's amazing if they really have.
Yeah, I myself am surprised at the success they've been experiencing. The speculation that I've heard is that Russia wants to make progress in the Donbass, and they were worried about the counteroffensive in Kherson, so they put their least confident, least experienced, least trained soldiers, many of them just militiamen from the LPR and DPR in the Kharkiv region, and those are the ones who are dropping their guns and running, basically. Or just surrendering if you don't want to do this anymore.
It's great to be a militiaman when you're on the winning side, right?
Yeah.
And you have a big brother that can look out for you, and you can take a little bit of a part in a battle, kind of like when you watch the movie 300, those Greek reservists that showed up, and they did their part, right? But
you, sir, what's your occupation?
Yeah. What is your occupation? Yeah, I'm a potter.
I brought more soldiers than you did.
Yeah, but they did their job, right? Like they did what they were supposed to do. And so the militiamen, they're probably, it's great to be a militiaman when you're on the attack, but man, when you're on the defensive, that gets kind of scary, especially when like, hey, my house is only 20 miles from here.
And these militiamen also have to know they're not the top priority of the Russian military as far as getting air support or resupplies or reinforcements. If things start to get pressure is applied to these militiamen, they don't know that the Russian senior leadership is actually going to back them up.
I don't know if they have the capability to do that either. I mean, even something like calling in air support, that would require having special assets on the ground that can do that. If the militia isn't trained, like it's not a factor of like, can we get it to them? It's a factor of can they handle it when we do get it to them, right? So it could also be a situation where they're trying to collapse back to a defensible position. Initially, I thought that Russia was just going to try to play this out to the winter and just see, all right, hopefully it's a cold winter. It's a cold winter. Germany says, you know what? It's too cold. Gas prices are too high. We don't have enough natural gas. Let's try to put pressure on Ukraine to come to a compromise. And I guess Russia just couldn't hold that line.
No, I don't think the ground forces in Russia are going to make it to this winter. I think we're going to see more units surrendering or some kind of strategic pullback, maybe just to hold Crimea. Maybe they just give up on the Donbass region and Russia says, we got to get out of this and maintain what we had 8 years ago by holding Crimea. So I think there is going to be a shift at some point in the next couple months, and they're just going to try and conserve what they already had before they started this war on their terms.
Yeah.
Now, you've talked about in a recent short the use of tactical nukes. This is getting a lot of attention in the media. So I'm curious what your rationale is, and maybe if you can just sum up your argument, why Russia would use a tactical nuke or why they wouldn't.
I guess to start, the first thing I want to say, and I'd hate to even write a missile or a memo about this, is I haven't once called them nukes, even if it's just easier to say that. I like to say tactical nuclear weapons because I want to give these weapons the gravity and the respect that they deserve. I think that from the Russian side, and it kind of reminds me of the movie Very Bad Things. There was a line Christian Slater said in the movie Very Bad Things, where they accidentally kill a dancer that came to their hotel. These guys are at a bachelor party. They accidentally kill a dancer that came to their hotel room to party with them. And Christian Slater has an amazing line in this where he says, if you take away all of your emotions and everything you've learned since you were in first grade, what we really have is a problem that needs to get moved from point A to point B. And as emotional as nuclear weapons are, if you look at it from a logical standpoint, and I hate to sound like Dr. Strangelove, from Russia's standpoint, using a tactical nuclear weapon to destroy a bridgehead or a troop concentration is a 105-pound problem that needs to be moved from point A to point B, if you take away all the political consequences. And I think that's one of the reasons that Ukraine attacked on multiple fronts, including Kherson, because they needed to spread their troops out so they would not make a tempting target for a tactical nuclear weapon. I don't think it's likely that it would happen because I think that China is looking over President Putin's shoulder. And China is saying, if you do this, it opens the seal. And once you open that seal, then it gives America the right to use a nuclear weapon against us if we ever decide to go against Taiwan. Because there's what? What are nuclear weapons? What are tactical nuclear weapons good for? Troop concentrations. They're good for bunkers that are deep underground. They're good for area denial or attacking, a target like an airfield, to destroy the airfield and then render it unsafe to use for a couple of weeks afterwards. Well, a nuclear weapon would be an ideal weapon to use against a battle group, right? Especially a battle group that is on the ocean where the radiation can disperse fairly quickly. So I can see China saying, "Don't you do it? Don't you do it?" I think it's less likely that it'll happen because of China. But I also think that if it does happen, it'll be an Su-34 because you have two crew members side by side. You can't have one crew member, right? You were a missileer. One crew member can have a conscious, they can suddenly develop a conscience and say, you know what, I'm not doing this. Two crew members keep each other honest. And two crew members side by side is even worse, right? Because now you can have a guy who can look at you and say, Misha, we have to do this for the motherland, for the Rodinia, right? I can see them being used on military targets only because I think that I don't even think a Russian pilot would destroy a city. I don't. I think they would turn around. They wouldn't follow orders to do that. And I think it has to be a plane because I think the strategic rocket forces or even the Navy would say, no, we're not doing this. There's just too many points, in that chain where you could have someone in that chain of command say, no, we're not doing this. Whereas with an Su-34, you load it up at a base. There's, I believe, two bases that hold the Su-34. One is near the western part of the country. And, hey, this is a training exercise. Load up the weapon on that fighter. You have the squadron commander who's loyal and another person who's loyal getting that fighter. They go to Ukraine. They do what they have to do at a bridgehead. So I don't want it to happen, but I think the most likely delivery method would be an Su-34 on a bridgehead.
I think you are correct in that the rationale that there's a lot of Russian officers who would refuse that order in an offensive war to just blow up, Kharkiv or Kiev when they're the aggressor. But things get dicey when all of a sudden Belgorod or a Russian city is being attacked, Rostov-on-Don, which is why I think American politicians have said to the Ukrainians, don't attack the Russians. Don't threaten the Russian civilian population because then you lose the higher ground. And if we are relying on human beings in the Russian military to refuse orders if Putin ever gives them, Ukraine has to maintain that level of higher ethical superiority even in war. I also think that politically you are correct that the reason why Russia, I don't even think they've seriously considered ever using a nuclear weapon. And the reason is the exclusive club, the other nuclear powers. The big economies are China and India, which Russia really needs to keep doing business with. But even the smaller players like Pakistan, North Korea, or even Israel, once you become the person that uses it for convenience because your ground forces can't succeed in an offensive war, you've now set the precedent for any other nuclear power or state that wants to acquire nuclear weapons. And by the way, Ukraine has nuclear reactors. They have a civilian nuclear program. They have the raw material if they really wanted to. So you also have to consider if Russia crosses that line, all bets are off for the Ukrainians to get the necessary resources, get some duct tape, patch together a quick weapon, and then deploy it immediately.
Yeah, I never thought of that. I guess that's possible. I think the fuel is different, but you probably know a lot more than me about that subject.
I could be wrong, but my understanding why most nuclear powers are cautious about countries developing civilian nuclear power programs like Iran is because the fuel waste can be converted to weapons grade uranium or plutonium. That's just what I've always considered. So it makes sense to me. For example, the South Koreans have civilian nuclear power. And if they wanted a nuclear warhead to counter North Korean aggression, they really could do it in a weekend. I don't think the Ukrainians are technologically as advanced as the South Koreans, but I'm pretty confident if they wanted to do it, they could do it as well. So the next question, how do you think this conflict in Ukraine has tested the NATO alliance, and what lessons learned do you think we can take away even 7 months into this conflict?
I think that it's exposed some cracks in Germany and Turkey. I think that Germany once had a military that you would have called the defensive envy of the world, right? With their Leopard tanks and a very strong army that was committed to deterring the Soviets. And I think what you've seen is Europe kind of took a look at itself in the mirror and went, we've been spending way too much on butter and need to spend a little bit more on guns. So when you look at the fact that Spain has more Leopards than Germany, Leopard tanks, that's kind of a clue that maybe we ought to up our defense spending a little bit. I also think that it's shown who our friends are. I've said this before in a tweet that still gets likes, that I think the only reason the U.S. is in Poland is to stop the Poles from marching north and attacking Russia. Pretty soon the Poles are going to have like the largest army in Europe between their army and their equivalent of the National Guard, their territorial defense forces. The Poles are totally on our side, and the fact that two countries. Sweden wants to join NATO. Finland wants to join NATO. That's incredible. Like, I never would have thought of that before. Ever. And that's a major undertaking. And to convert everything to a NATO standard, to be able to mate weapons onto non-NATO planes, that's a heck of an undertaking.
They want that Article 5 security guarantee. At this point, Vladimir Putin has exposed himself that it's one thing to posture and to threaten, to maybe have political leverage to benefit your people, benefit your economy. But to actually, act on it with a full-scale invasion like they've done in Ukraine, I just don't know. I don't know how Putin ever realistically thought that he could continue to travel to Europe and do business, attend summits and just pretend like nothing happened. He obviously thought that this war would have been over in 3 to 7 days,
Yeah.
Maybe Zelensky would have fled. There would have been a collapse of the government. There wouldn't have been, brutality and bloodshed and mass casualties like there was.
Yeah.
Otherwise, yeah, why would he do that? Why would he relegate himself to being on the same level as a dictator like, Kim Jong Un?
Yeah. I don't have an answer for that. I wish I did. I can't get into the guy's head. You know who could? You should have her on your show, Ksenia Terekova. She is a Russian journalist. Now she works for Voice of America. She's been on my channel a couple of times. She would probably be able to answer that question as to how Vladimir Putin thinks.
I will happily look into her and see if she'd like to make an appearance.
I'll give her your contact info.
Let me ask you, since you're the tank guy, with the recent success for the whole world to see of Javelin missiles and NLAWs, do you think the modern tank has become obsolete, or is there still a place for it in modern armies going forward?
I think it's on its way out. I don't think armored vehicles are on their way out, but I think that the modern tank that's extremely heavy with a large gun is on its way out. I'm actually developing a video right now, and hopefully I'll be able to collaborate with the chieftain, with Nicholas Moran, who has his own incredible tank channel on YouTube. He's forgotten more about tanks than I'll ever know. I'm doing a video right now about what a tank might look like in the future, and I believe that we're going to move toward IVFs, infantry fighting vehicles, that have some anti-tank capability, mainly because tanks just, in order for a tank to fight, the tank has to have high mobility. It has to have this triangle of mobility, of firepower, and of protection. And if you have more mobility, you have less firepower. If you have more firepower and protection, you have less mobility. So what you kind of end up with is there's trade-offs in everything you do. And the more army you add, the heavier it gets. And the heavier it gets, the harder it is to move, and the more fuel you need. And at some point, you have diminishing returns. And when you have an anti-tank missile that costs $100,000 that can destroy a $3 million tank, or in South Korea's case, an $8 million tank, that's a problem. That is not a math equation you can work out. But if you can create an infantry fighting vehicle for $1 million, $1.5 million, and this infantry fighting vehicle has an active protection system on it, and this infantry fighting vehicle carries infantry that can ride with the vehicle and provide infantry protection, clear out buildings, and the infantry fighting vehicle can support them, and they also carry missiles to knock out enemy tanks that remain. I think that's where the future might go. I also believe we might see robotic vehicles or semi-autonomous tanks. Killer tanks. Think of it like a gun on treads that can be autonomous or semi-autonomous and controlled from the IVF. America has had killer computers since the 1980s with the Aegis system on the Ticonderoga class cruisers that filtered down to the American destroyers. And the Patriot missile system, that is a robotic killer. You turn that thing on to automatic mode, you sit back, and you watch the missiles fly. It makes all these decisions for you. So now with AI, there's no reason why you can't identify threats, even down to human threats, and looking at their posture. You can use right now, we have, there is software in, I want to say it was Sweden, that can detect subway jumpers by their posture. So
before they jump the turnstile?
The software has looked at subway jumpers, and because they have cameras in the subway, and they say, all right, this guy, they have footage from people who've jumped in front of trains. So they just have to feed that into an algorithm that does machine learning, and they go, all right, well, whenever someone starts pacing like this or making these furtive movements or whatever.
Oh, you're talking about if people are trying to take their life by jumping in front of a train.
Commit suicide on the subway, yeah.
Oh,
jump
wow.
in front of a train. So there's software that can detect that. That is right now in Sweden. They have this software. When they installed it, I want to say it was in 2019. It might have been 2020, early 2020. The software saved a life within 1 week. So if you can figure out whether someone's going to jump in front of a train, you can figure out whether their posture is that of a farmer carrying a shotgun, protecting his farm against a flock, or a militiaman carrying a shotgun. They're just based on their posture and their awareness. So you can do that. You can also identify tanks a lot easier than a human being can, and from further away. So I could easily see essentially a vehicle that's far lighter, because when you take out the life support, think
Yeah.
of everything that's inside of a tank to keep the crew alive. The heater, the radios, that the CVC plugs, the seats, the
Communication
space that you
equipment.
need. I think, yeah. When you take all that stuff out, you have a smaller vehicle. Smaller means lighter. Lighter means cheaper. You give that thing a gun, a high caliber, high velocity gun to destroy other tanks and fortifications. Then you give it an autocannon to engage troops, and then you give it a lighter medium machine gun to engage troops or do escalation of force. And you have that controlled from an APC that's riding right behind it. Now you have a robotic or semi-autonomous vehicle. It could even be semi-autonomous in the sense that it finds a target and you're the one who has to push the button to engage, and then it just goes loose to the next target. We can
So
do
how
that now.
far away do you think we are from that being a reality?
We can do that now. That's trivial. That's trivial. We can do that now. We just need the will to do
Let's
so.
talk about contracts and developments, and then
Yeah.
actual. It's like, do you think the specs have already been made for this, and they just need to get the approval to build it, or?
There is a tank, a semi-autonomous vehicle called the Ripsaw. That I don't remember who developed that, but I believe it has a small autocannon. It's essentially just a small tank, with an autocannon. Um, I've worked in government contracting before, so I don't want to quote how long it'll take something, to do, how long it'll take to do something, mainly because there's always a catch. But we could probably have something up and running within 2 years or so. The software is easy. We can just repurpose off the shelf stuff,
Yeah.
for identifying threats. That's machine learning AI. And the rest is all just creating a secure connection. You could even create a near field connections. That way, it's very difficult to detect or jam. One of my big things has always been EW and e-signature. So, the battlefield, people think of the battlefield in 3 dimensions, but it's really 5 dimensions if you include space and you include electronic warfare. Electronic warfare is the 5th dimension, right? So everything on the battlefield right now that has a radio in it is emitting an electronic signature. And yeah, you can frequency hop and all that, but it's emitting a signature. So if you can lower that signature by lowering the power and just have a mesh network, you can control these vehicles as long as they're nearby, and that'll reduce your e-signature.
All very fascinating. I'm already learning stuff, new from you just in this podcast. We're currently on day 208 of this conflict in Ukraine. This is pure speculation, but where do you think we're going? How do you think this war will eventually end?
I mean, if I could correctly predict that, I would be able to correctly predict whether the Wizards were going to win the playoffs this year. Um, I don't know. I don't know. I think that the end state is going to be Ukraine negotiating from a position of strength rather than a position of weakness. I don't know if Ukraine has the armored vehicles to take back all of their territory. And Crimea is just a dog's breakfast, because that would require an amphibious invasion. It would be hard for us to do, essentially. And then people are fighting with their backs to the wall. Like, oh, God, that's a tough one. I think the end state is going to be some sort of negotiated settlement and a peacekeeping force, perhaps a semi-autonomous region that's kind of like the Kurds in Iraq, or the Sinai Peninsula, where we have a peacekeeping force, an international peacekeeping force that keeps the peace on the border between Russia and these separatist states. There are people in these separatist states in the Donbass region who do not want to be a part of Ukraine. right?
So you think it's a possibility there's some kind of not demilitarized zone, but a zone, like you said, with an international peacekeeping force agreed upon by both Russia and Ukraine to have a presence, like in the Donbass region?
I see something like that happening. I think it's going to be very difficult to take back all that territory. It's going to be very difficult to do that. It's not the will of the Ukrainian people, which is incredible. It's just the mathematics of equipment. They only have so many heavy vehicles, heavy fighting vehicles. There's only so many heavy fighting vehicles in the world. And there's only so many that Ukraine has, and there's only so many that they can capture from Russia. So I think that taking back all those regions may be difficult, but I think they can take back enough that they can say to Russia, let's come to the table, and they negotiate from a position of strength. And eventually we have a peacekeeping force in that region.
Well, you've given me some things to consider and think about. I want to give you the final word. Is there anything else you'd like to explain or share or talk about to the audience?
Boy, I wasn't actually expecting that question. I guess the thing that I would say to the audience is that Russia preys on your ignorance. Russia takes advantage of the fact that you don't know a lot about military equipment, that you don't know a lot about tactics. So Russian sophists, they can take a look at a weapon that isn't a cluster bomb and trick you into thinking that Ukraine is using cluster bombs. Or they can trick you into thinking that Ukraine is shooting mines into occupied cities, because you just don't know enough about how the military works. So I would encourage anybody out there to do research for yourself. Read a couple of good books on military tactics. Start with On War by von Clausewitz. And then maybe go to some American military manuals like FM 21-3, which is the Bible for the infantry. It's the infantry, rifle, platoon, and squad. Start with those two manuals and learn a little bit about how the military works, so that way you can inoculate yourself against Russian propaganda.
Very well said. I appreciate those recommendations. I will be looking them up on Amazon. Mr. Ryan McBeth, thank you so much for your time. Hopefully, maybe at some point in the future, we can collaborate again.
I would love to do that. Thank you so much. I appreciate this.
Till the next time, guys, take care.